Hey everyone, yes, it's Rich, and yes, I'm back in the world of PUBG, Player Unknown's Battlegrounds. It's been a long while since we took a look at this, and many patch revisions have taken place in the meantime. And on top of that, the developer itself has recently updated its roadmap for the game, where we find quite a startling and, well, honestly, welcome admission that performance on Xbox One just isn't up to scratch. In fact, let's bring up a direct quote. To put it bluntly, we are simply not satisfied with the game's current console performance, and especially so during tense moments of on-screen action. Pretty damning then, and in line with our prior tests where PUBG's in-game frame rate fluctuates between 20 to 30 FPS, and where encounters with other players often cause performance drops at a time where you really need that frame rate to be consistent. But there have been improvements since we last looked at the game. So what we're doing here is playing PUBG on both Xbox One and Xbox One X. Tom Morgan took the base model and I was on the enhanced console, and we buddied up to play for a couple of hours. Now the idea here is, well, this game is so dynamic, so variable, that we kind of have to have both players in the same place at the same time to ensure that like-for-like tests are accurate. I'd say that the overall frame rate trend is clearly a touch higher than it was, and it's especially apparent in these opening lobbies. So back in the day, the lobbies would cause frame rate to absolutely tank. Now perhaps there is a reduction in visible player count or something similar, but the fact is that your first impression of the game is now significantly improved because you are seeing a better lock to the target 30 FPS. I mean, it's clearly not perfect, you can still see plenty of drops beneath, and what's equally clear is that having Xbox One X hardware does not offer you any concrete guarantee of improved performance over the standard model, but at least it's not the complete stutter fest that it was. Similarly, it's clear that some work has been done on LODs when you're in the carrier plane at the beginning of each game, because again, aside from that absolutely ginormous stutter right at the start there, well, frame rates once again level out at 30 for the most part. That definitely didn't happen when we last tested the game. One area that hasn't been addressed though is the initial descent once you jump out of the plane. Tracking this one, you can see that the action is still extremely choppy, and again, there's not really any X advantage in terms of performance. In fact, depending on context, it may well even run slower than the standard Xbox. The upside of this, well, okay, let's rephrase that because there aren't too many upsides to 15 frames per second performance really, but well, you are getting significantly improved level of detail on the X side. You can see that here as we jump from the plane and target the military base as our landing zone. Far more of the base detail is being rendered on the X side, while on the base Xbox, it's kind of a bit barren there. As we begin our final descent though, yeah, it's actually smoother on the less capable machine. But to be clear here, performance is still so variable in these jumps that either of the consoles can take point at any given moment. PUBG still has a pretty profound issue in terms of that opening couple of minutes. Once you're on the ground and the weapons foraging begins, it takes some time for performance to stabilize to 30 FPS, and bizarrely, it does seem that, at least in the area we're testing here, there's no clear winner between the two consoles. Now, our clips shown so far have shown the base model to take a lead here, but it's not by any stretch a consistent advantage. In this descent, the X is faster, and in that opening weapons grab, it's the X that is smoother. So thus far, we've kind of concentrated on the initial stages of the game. It's handshake, if you like, where we've seen some improvements, but also plenty of the same old, same old. But this is the beginning of the game only, not representative of the vast bulk of PUBG action. To get a truly accurate view of our session with the game, I actually ran 90 minutes of capture from both versions through our tools, and I'm struggling to see much consistency, to be honest. So here, we're nowhere near the beginning of the game. We're about 6 minutes in actually, and we're still searching for decent kit. We're in a house just exploring, and bizarrely the Xbox One X drops frames while the standard model doesn't. I mean, the X can get down to like 22 frames per second here while its counterpart remains at 30. It's kind of baffling. A few minutes on and we're both leaving this settlement. Frame drops on the base Xbox, no problems at all on the X. Taking a wander together through this town and X has an advantage, but it's still really uneven all around. Another interesting point is a visual improvement X gets that a normal Xbox doesn't. A depth of field effect that kicks in on the background when you're looking over your inventory. Now in this scene, once again we have a pretty strange performance deficit on the X, but you can see a big stutter as we jump into inventory and a further hit to performance while we're in the menu. It just feels rather unresponsive. I mean, of course it does, we're in 20 frames per second territory here. Now my question for the developer here is pretty straightforward. Why have that depth of field effect at all if it is tanking your frame rate? It seems it was removed on the standard Xbox and for good reason. Next up I want to talk about traversal. So in the spring Xbox roadmap for PUBG, the developers talk about reducing streaming hitches by distributing more game work across all CPU cores. Now this is a pretty easy one to test. We both sit in the same vehicle and we drive about at speed. Previously we found that doing this while there are plenty of players in the vicinity can cause some pretty bad issues. Well, here we are driving away from the military base, and depending on the terrain you do see performance drops. X has a small advantage, as you would expect, as it has a significantly faster CPU. But driving through this town, X and the standard model jostle for positioning here. We noted anything from 24 to 30 frames per second here, which is not great. We tried to equalize visual output as much as we could by shifting to a first-person view, and it still looks variable, but X does have a clear performance lead in this test. So in this Jeep we were actually looking to track down a supply drop, and when we found it, well, we encountered another PUBG performance problem. Alpha textures. The red smoke from the drop absolutely tanks the frame rate, less than 20 FPS on Xbox One X and anything down to 10 FPS on the standard Xbox. Now on the X we have the double whammy of the depth of field effect and the smoke, so grabbing stuff from the drop here is exceptionally unpleasant as the frame rate is just so bad. Now, you'll note that when Tom on the less capable Xbox moves away from the drop, and indeed the smoke, his performance stabilizes, but I'm on the X still wading through treacle in the menu system attempting to pick up those items. Once we're back in the Jeep together though, yeah, the X can flex its muscles somewhat and powers ahead of the standard Xbox. Okay, so why the X isn't consistently ahead is curious. It may well be down to the richer detail in the scene, which means more draw calls for the CPU and obviously more GPU load. But I think the takeaway here is that background streaming is clearly still an issue. PUBG just plays a lot worse when you're in a vehicle, and the primary extra load that travelling at speed adds is the need to decompress and process more world data more quickly. And maybe that atrocious performance at the beginning of each game when you're skydiving is kinda like the perfect storm of bottlenecks. High speed traversal, meaning tons of stuff being streamed in along with plenty of other characters in the vicinity, along with, of course, a large level of world detail to render. Okay, so I want to talk in more depth about a problem that the developers highlight themselves. Performance being subpar when you're in the heat of battle. Now this is the principal problem I personally have with the Xbox version of PUBG. You need smooth response and decent performance to play at your best in the heat of a firefight. Looking at every battle that we had and indeed lost, they are all accompanied by poor frame rates. Here's our first death of the session. A big alpha texture there, the blood spurt, it just sort of tanks performance and we have a big frame time spike. But this is on top of already depressed frame rates during the encounter. Next up, we were gunned down mercilessly at the military base. I mean, we just turned up there too late with no tools. And yes, 27 frames per second on the X and worse on the base model. I mean, this was a quick death, so any performance drop here may well be layered on top of the already poor performance you get at the beginning of every game. Our next encounter actually occurred fairly late on in the game. Tom and I are taking fire from snipers quite a way out. And yes, we have no similar weaponry for adequately returning fire, but the performance metrics are stark here. Our eventual killers close in and there's no contest, we're out for the count. Now, I should also add that a kind of invisible performance metric that is of crucial importance is input lag. We had this measured close to the game's launch at 133 milliseconds at 30 frames per second, which is far from optimal and doesn't include display latency, I should add. Now that's pretty bad, but you can layer on top additional lag when the performance drops, which happened in every encounter that we tested. So is there actually any good news here? Well, as I said at the beginning, the lobbies and the initial flight, giant stutter aside, are now smoother than they were. Texture streaming does seem to be better now in terms of resolving higher quality art more quickly, though there are still some really pixelated examples of art out there, particularly in terms of in-house debris. And similar to the last time we looked at PUBG, when you are just doing basic traversal on foot, which can be a lot of the gameplay to be fair, yes, you can get a flatline 30 frames per second. But the fundamental issues with PUBG on Xbox remain and haven't improved that drastically. Gunplay doesn't feel good because the lag is bad and the performance is super variable. A lot of the times it feels almost impossible to track what's going on because the frame rate is so variable and can tank so badly. Any drops to performance in a fast-paced shooter aren't particularly good, but drops to 20 frames per second or below? Yeah, that's just not gonna work. Especially in a world where Epic's Fortnite has, certainly against our expectations at least, delivered a beautiful 60 FPS mode for all consoles. Now, it's a very different game in many respects, but that's the standard that has been set. Yes, we did have fun with PUBG on Xbox here, but we had more fun elsewhere, and that's kind of the key problem right now for this port. Yes, it is early access, and yes, it's had plenty of patches, but in our view, it still needs urgent attention. So I'm going to leave things there. Do like and subscribe to support our work, and yes, do please consider supporting the Digital Foundry Patreon if you want to go the extra mile and get some pristine quality video in the process. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching.